Hi, my name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, or TPhGames as my little games channel here is called, and today we will talk about Elden Ring Nightreign. So this is my critique of Nightreign, and I overall liked the game and enjoyed it quite a bit, especially in co-op with friends, other streamers and community members. Let us stay positive and start with the pros, the things that Elden Ring Nightreign did pretty well. I was very impressed, for example, with the launch of the game. Considering the massive success of Elden Ring, the base game, I expected that many players would want to play this game, which I think is the case, but I also expected, as a result, that the servers will have a lot of issues and you will just sit in login queue on release day for hours. But that was not the case. I could just start the game, connect and play with my friends without any issues. And that is very impressive in my opinion, because even other big releases, think of, I don't know, Diablo 4 or something, had trouble at launch day. And it's not unusual because the capacities you need to kind of process the massive amount of players just flooding in is very demanding on the server side. I still got 2 bingos on my release issue bingo card, but to be honest, those were mostly minor issues. And one thing on the card, they confirm that the newly added mechanic will feel clunky, is actually fixed by now, which was the vaulting and climbing, which felt very good at times, but sometimes extremely clunky and didn't work that well. After the first patch, that was gone, and vaulting and climbing worked so much better, so they completely fixed that one. So much that I would remove that bingo field, and in addition, they were also very fast fixing this. It will take FromSoft ages to patch anything, and here they patched it extremely fast, like in a couple of days. It was gone and much better. For further context, I play the Steam version of Elden Ring Nightreign, so on PC. I have no idea how it worked on console when it launched, but as far as I'm aware, it worked pretty well. Maybe let me know in the comments what your experience there was. Beyond that, we have the classic FromSoft strength. So the combat is fun because for the most part it uses what Elden Ring has to offer and adds a few more things, plus forcing you to use other builds and weapons. As a result, there is a lot of variety in the game. The soundtrack is fantastic, and also the art style is, as it was already in Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree, very beautiful and works quite well. Then with the addition of the Iron Eye class, you finally have somebody who can use bows, and bows are not complete trash, which is the biggest surprise. I guess crossbows are still not great, but bows at least, and especially the Iron Eye class, is fantastic and one of the strongest in the game, I would say. I also was a bit worried about how interesting these classes play out, and I have to admit they definitely nailed it there and made very interesting classes, especially the Recluse, which is far more complex than I would have anticipated, with her ability to mix different element affinities together to kind of form spells. It reminded me a bit of Dota's Invoker in this regard. She's not as complex as Invoker, but still pretty complex with a lot of interesting spells that she has, especially the support spells that are quite interesting and very useful at times. So there is a very interesting class, but also the other classes work quite well and play very differently each. So FromSoft did a very good job there. Also, what I like is that all legendary weapons got new special abilities. Some of the legendary weapons from the base game, you know, they are complete trash and nobody uses them ever. Here you definitely reconsider their use because first of all they have the best scaling, so they do a lot of damage, and in addition they have some neat additional effects that sometimes occur on just using the normal attacks of the weapon, which is a pretty cool idea in my opinion. And now with the last patch, as mentioned, the movement is a lot of fun, so that also works pretty well. We already see some neat movement strategies to get to certain places faster, like on the top of a castle or whatever, which is pretty cool and to be expected if you give the player so many options when it comes to movement. What I also like is that they adjusted a bit the balance of weapons in the game, quite a bit actually, which makes things fresh and interesting. We know all the weapons in Nightreign from the base game Elden Ring already, there's nothing new there, and we know which weapons were good in the base game, but that does not necessarily mean they are also good in Nightreign. There are some interesting examples. For example, the spell Night Comet is an interesting one. It is one of the strongest spells in base game Elden Ring, but in Nightreign it's just okay. And not necessarily because they changed the values too much, it's because the staff does not give you 30% bonus damage on invisibility sorceries anymore, that you also find close to where you find Night Comet. So that is out of the equation. And further, in Nightreign you rarely fight NPC enemies, which is different in base game Elden Ring, where there are a lot of NPC fights. And NPCs won't dodge Night Comet, so Night Comet is a very strong spell because it does more damage and also is hard to dodge for most enemies. So that definitely is an advantage that suddenly is reduced in Nightreign. Suddenly Glintstone Comet Shard is a much more powerful spell in direct comparison when it comes to damage and stamina and FP cost. But it's also not like that Night Comet is now unusable. It's still a very good spell, and now you have other options that are equally good, you could say. So in this regard, I think that's a positive. There are of course still weapons that were broken in the base game and are still very strong or broken in this game here as well in Nightreign. But on the other side, there were also some weapons that were absolutely broken in the main game and now are just good weapons. I would say Starfist is maybe a good example for that. They are now tuned down quite a bit simply due to enemies not staggering as much anymore as they did in the base game. So this definitely helps the weapon variety when it comes to viable weapons that are fun to use, and that's definitely overall a very positive point here. Now with all that said, we can come to the neutral points. I think one of the most important things to understand when you want to play or consider playing Nightreign is that it's very different from playing Elden Ring. It is Elden Ring in name as well, and there's a lot of Elden Ring in it, but how it works and how you play it is definitely different. I think the biggest part is if you primarily like exploring a massive world and take your time with that, and this is why you loved Elden Ring, then Nightreign might not be for you, because this game is not about exploration. This game is about being constantly in a hurry, rushing, having no time, and being very efficient, accomplishing certain objectives to level up as fast as you can to be powerful enough at the end to defeat a very difficult boss with your co-op partners at the very end. And towards this goal you work the whole time, and you are under constant time pressure. There's no time to appreciate the vista, there's no time to appreciate the architecture of a building or find some hidden lore details here in the environment and in the level design or whatever. That's not what you do in Nightreign. In Nightreign you are just constantly on the move, killing as much things as possible, accomplishing as many things as possible, so that you are equipped and ready for the final fight at the very end. Then another thing I put in neutral, because it's kind of neutral and does not reflect your experience when you're new to the game, but if you have played, let's say 50, 60, 70, 100 hours in the game, you notice that there are certain patterns in how the map works, and you also know which places are good to level up and which places aren't. As a result, some kind of meta develops that you just replay over and over again, and then things become very similar, repetitive I would call it, and the magic wears a bit down, if that makes sense. It's not as interesting anymore, and I notice some fatigue playing the game for so many hours that I don't want to do always the same, so I have to start challenges or other things to kind of shake things up a little bit again. But if I want to be successful, I know exactly what I have to do, and I know exactly which places I will visit and which places I won't visit and prioritize in my route. On one hand, that is to be expected and natural. Like at some point, people have completed the content and potentially move on. On the other hand, FromSoft can counter this by releasing more content and changing things up again. That also maybe through balance, through new enemies, bosses, and also changes of the map, new events, and maybe a new map would also be awesome, but that sounds more like a bigger project for an expansion or something. So in this regard, I hope FromSoft can keep up and keep things fresh. And while recording these lines, they just released a more powerful, difficult version of an already existing boss that you can now play, and you get a different currency. And this again piques interest. They for sure have some kind of internal roadmap what to do. I hope they can put out these new steps, these new additions to the game fast enough to keep the game alive and interesting. The next point I put in neutral because I feel it's very subjective, but it sounds a bit stupid, but I found the story of Nightreign so far very cryptic. And I know the story of FromSoft Souls games is always cryptic. I played them all, and I also invested a decent amount of time to read descriptions and understand the lore in Elden Ring, in the Dark Souls games, and so on. But here I watched the ending cutscene, or several of the ending cutscenes, and thought to myself, okay, I have no idea what's going on and what they really want to tell me here. And that felt a little bit unsatisfying for me, considering that I have already put in some time for understanding Elden Ring's lore and so on. But in this regard here, I felt like it was unusual cryptic, even for FromSoft Souls standards, when it comes to story. Maybe I'm alone, it's maybe more of a me problem, so I put this point here in the neutral section. But let us now move to the negative side of Nightreign, to the things I would criticize and some problems I want to discuss here that the game also has. Still, overall, I enjoy the game and like it a lot, but you can always find things that could have been done better, and so that is also the case in Elden Ring Nightreign. And let us start with one that I call the classic one. And that is the camera. And I will include here the lock-on system because from my perspective it's part of the camera system. So, surprise, it is still completely trash. This is still terrible, and camera was always a problem, especially if you fight close to a wall, so you have an object behind your character. The camera does not know what to do, kind of, and then it zooms in a lot and you only see the back of your character but not what the boss is doing anymore, and it's highly annoying. So FromSoft hasn't really solved these issues here in Nightreign anyway, but since it's an open world, it is not that big of a problem because often you have enough space. There are certain enemies and bosses and locations where it can become annoying again as well, and some lock-in points are absolutely terrible set, like just think of locking into the head of a Deathrite bird that also appears in Nightreign, and when you are close to him and then the camera does really weird things and you get highly confused with what is going on at all. And then we have the lock-on system where you want to switch between enemies. And in Elden Ring you usually don't fight larger groups of enemies, but here in Nightreign this happens a lot. And then when you move your right stick to switch the target, it doesn't work, and you move the stick again, still doesn't work, and maybe on the third or fourth time it works. Sometimes it works instantly, so it feels very inconsistent in this regard and is often confusing and kind of distracting you from fighting a potential tough enemy, so you get hit or die yourself in these circumstances. In addition, there's also the mechanic that when somebody's HP, so a teammate or yours, go down to 0, you fall down on the ground and then you can be revived if your teammates hit you. So you can also lock in your teammates when they are down, and sometimes getting the camera locked onto a teammate is infuriating. It simply doesn't work, especially when you have to consider that the boss is still attacking you and you have to find windows or time for hitting your downed teammate a few times. Then you often miss the opportunity to do this because you are fighting the camera for 5 seconds. That's something that FromSoft needs to fix somehow. The next point on my list is about some UI design decisions that could be improved in my opinion. First of all, I have to explain this a little bit. So behind the scenes in Nightreign, you still have the attributes, you know, from the base game. So the stats like vigor, endurance, strength, dexterity, and so on. So they still exist, but when you are at a grace, you can only press level up and everything happens automatically. But each character prioritizes these stats differently, depending on the character, of course. But the game does not tell you where the priorities are in-game, only in the round table. There's a visual codex and there you can look it up. For example, the Wilder has, let's say, dexterity scaling of B and strength scaling of A. So you know he has more strength than dex. If you don't know the exact value, you can't look it up, but you have kind of an idea which weapons work best on this character. In my opinion, to make it a bit more beginner-friendly, they should definitely add, if you press start, a tab where you simply can see the list with what stats my character prioritizes and what stats not. Further, this ties into another problem, because every weapon in the game also has an attribute scaling, and if you find the weapon, it doesn't show you. The only way to find out the weapon scalings is you go again to the visual codex and look up the weapon scalings there. That is also not ideal. They could simply add, when you find a weapon, a little symbol for strength, dex, phase, intelligence, arcane, and simply put a little letter next to it. That's all we need. And then with one look, you could see, okay, this has dex scaling B, strength scaling D, so I know it's a dex weapon. Of course, players who play tons of Elden Ring kind of know the scalings of these weapons, and they also simplified them, so each weapon category has now basically the same scaling with some exceptions, but still, there are quite a few weapon types in Elden Ring, and expecting that players simply know is, in my opinion, not ideal. I mean, in many cases, it's kind of logic that a large club or whatever has a better strength scaling than, I don't know, a thrusting sword. But even if you know the scalings of the base game very well, that's not always that helpful, because there were also some strange scalings for certain weapons. Let's say among the thrusting swords there was the Noble Astok. It had a strength scaling of D and a dex scaling of D, so it wasn't really a dex weapon. Now in Nightreign they changed the scaling to fit all the other thrusting swords for this particular weapon, which is good, I think, but overall you can see how this can be very confusing, and there are also exceptions, like for example the large club has an S scaling only in strength and no scalings with other stats, which is different for the other clubs in this category. So in this regard, when you add exceptions to it, you simply have to show what the scalings are in the game when I pick up the weapon. It is, in my opinion, very stupid to say, yeah, just learn them by heart. That's not good UI design, and that is what I'm critiquing here. I'm not saying that it's impossible to learn this, I just say it would be better UI design if we could see it with one look. In addition, there are also tons of things that the game simply does not explain, and FromSoft just assumes the players will magically know this. Of course, players who have played Elden Ring a lot most likely will know about some of these details, but new players won't. And though there are a lot of guides and helpful information in the game in the visual codex, which you can read up to clarify certain things, it is there, but not everything is explained. A classic example would be which buffs override each other. Well, that's sometimes difficult to tell if you are not deep into this particular topic. Then if we move on to the next point, that is definitely that the game has no crossplay, which I can't fully understand. Like, Elden Ring is a massive franchise selling millions of copies, and then in Nightreign they don't dare to add crossplay for whatever reason. I don't know, there's no excuse for this, and I hope that maybe this might change at some point, maybe they can patch it in or so, I have no idea, but so far I think that's very unfortunate in my opinion. Further, there's no 2-player mode, which would be much appreciated, so fingers crossed that they will add it in a patch at some point, but for now it is not in the game. There's a mod on PC that allows you to play with 2 players, which is kind of funny, but I can definitely see if they focused on server stability on launch, that they kind of accomplished in my opinion. It had a very good launch, I would say, so if that is what it takes to get that, then I guess it's okay if they add it at some point later. Of course, also balancing for 2 players might be a concern, so I hope they put in some work into this and add it later at some point. Fingers crossed. Then there are also some balancing issues here and there, which can be addressed in patches easily, I think, and is to be expected. Not everything will be perfectly balanced. A classic example would be some bosses feel extremely hard in comparison to others, while others feel like complete pushovers. Let's say the Bell-Bearing Hunter with red glowing eyes down in the castle in the middle. Well, if you find that one, you say, well, let's maybe skip that guy, because he is really tough in direct comparison, and that often takes too much time to beat him for what you get out of him, and often it's kind of dangerous to get wiped by him. Further, I don't know, falling star beast can also be quite tough and take so much time, while other bosses die like in literally seconds if you have a good setup. So in this regard, I feel like a few things there can be done on the balancing side of things. The next point is a bit more neutral again, I would say, because it depends on if you like the core gameplay loop of the game, because it's about landing in Limvale, this area, and then slowly fighting some early enemies, some early bosses, have a good plan and route to get more powerful, leveling up your character, get the equipment that you need for the final boss, and then at the final boss, if you played for the first time, you most likely die there, if you're not exceptionally talented or lucky. And in this regard, if this happens, you have to do all what you have just done again. And this takes like 30 minutes. So you start from 0 again, level up, find the equipment, and then fight the final boss, and then you die again, and then this repeats all the time. And this can be frustrating, I think, for some players. Like in Elden Ring, if you die at a boss and it's tough, you can just instantly go into the boss room and fight him again and again and again, and you learn every time a bit more. So there's a bit of slow progression that you notice yourself, that you get better with a certain boss. In Nightreign, you have always like a 30+ minute break before you can get a second shot at the final boss. And if it's not your boss and you struggle with him and you die a lot, this can be very frustrating. So this is something you have to consider if you want to play Nightreign, if this sounds fun for you, if you enjoy the leveling up part enough and having always in your match and finding new equipment and have to kind of learn dealing with that. If that is what you enjoy, and then potentially you don't mind wiping at the final boss at the end. But after 100+ hours, I have to admit now that they added the new spiced up version of the second boss, which I also already defeated, have to admit it slowly gets annoying also for me to just go through this loop. I just want to fight the new boss. I've done all the stuff before a billion times, and we talked earlier about that some kind of meta develops. You know where to go, and it's always kind of the same loop, just with different equip. But even as somebody who enjoyed this loop for quite some time, I also got now to a point where I start enjoying it less, if that makes sense. In this regard, I came to the realization that only adding new final bosses won't do the trick. They have to change the map. They have to add other map events that switch things up. And maybe they also have to add new weapons and equipment to keep it fresh and interesting, because at some point you have played all the weapons, you know which weapons are good, which weapons are not so good, and then you notice you always play the same, let's say 20 weapons that you consider the best and be most successful with it. I can definitely see that adding new classes will definitely change something, but the changes that need to be done to keep this game alive for a long time are not just adding new final bosses or something to the game. They'd have to do more for that. Speaking of map events, one problem I see with these events is that some are flat out better than others, and until recently you could not change what event comes, so it was always kind of random. And I feel like that's a problem because it does not really help you, and it's sometimes difficult for new players to consider what map is great and what they should do and what not. And I would say 1 is really good, 2 are good to okayish, and 1 is, I think, the worst in this selection of events that we currently have. And that would be the city. The city is very risky. If you are a very good player and play with a very good team, and you can complete it 100% every time, I think the city is good. But if that's not the case, and I think for a lot of players that might not be the case, then you should definitely not do the city. First of all, you can do it early because it's very scaled up, so you need some level ups for it for sure. So you have to do it day 2. Then it's very close to the border of the map, so the zone is there very early. And the final boss in the city is just the king of stalling at times, and then he can take quite a bit of time to defeat, depending on your team composition for that. So these factors add up into you losing so much time, and when you have to abort, that's terrible already, because you could have done something more useful in the meantime and got nothing out of it. And the final boss in the city is basically what makes it, in my opinion, viable overall. Further on, you also, if you die there, you won't get your runes back. So you lost a level, won't get your runes back, and this is then the final nail in the coffin that is your run. On top of that, you don't have the big castle in the middle when the city is there. And this is usually a much more efficient place to get tons of runes and level up. There are definitely very efficient ways to accumulate a ton of runes, and the city is not necessarily one of them. This might be, as said, different if you have a very good team and you have a strat and you know exactly how to handle the city and so on. Then this can work out for you. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I just say for, I think, most players, especially newer players, this is potentially a complete death trap. It doesn't help that it's also a maze, so you can get lost there easily and you have to walk quite a bit. And further, what is also problematic is that if you die at the final boss, you get, for whatever reason, spawned somewhere in the city and have to find the way back. And often players are completely lost finding this way back, me included. And that is also a terrible design decision in my opinion. So that is also an additional problem there. The last and next point is a bit subjective, I would definitely say. And that is that they added a lot of bosses from my personal list of bosses I absolutely hate fighting in classic Elden Ring, and it does not necessarily change in Nightreign. For example, Ancient Dragon Hastags is also in Nightreign, and I hate this boss fight with a passion. It's not my favorite one, so I always think, oh god, not that guy again. Same goes with the new added bosses, the 8 Night Lords. I think I only like half of them, and the other half, one is okayish, then there is now the new spiced up version of that okayish boss, and the others I don't like fighting at all. Of course, it is to be expected that a player doesn't like every boss, but it has become a bit noticeable that some bosses and enemies here in Nightreign are a bit annoying, also among the Night Lords, because some Night Lords you have to just run so much to get even close to the boss, and then he jumps away again, you have to run. And you spend more time running after the boss than actually fighting him, and that sometimes is annoying, and then you get wiped by some weird AoE attack you have never seen before. So that definitely is a pattern here in the boss design, and I understand why they did this. So this works better with 3 players, that they need these AoE attacks, but design wise that is not my absolute favorite how I like my boss fights. At the same time, I understand why they do this, because the approach to designing bosses must be different if you have 3 players in mind all the time. But I also would wish that the balance between, I don't know, running after bosses and especially the size of bosses would be chosen a bit better. Though to be fair, there are definitely some good examples here as well. So sometimes these smaller bosses also suddenly go into this insanity mode with AoE attacks and whatnot, and you have to be very focused. But at the same time, I think those bosses work better for me because they're easier to read, and it's easier to stay close to them and hit them versus some of the much bigger bosses in direct comparison. Was never that big of a fan of the massive bosses in Elden Ring itself, to be fair, so I guess I'm kind of consistent in this matter of taste, I think, but that might be different for other people. And I think some of these bosses are simply not that fun for me to play, even though I can defeat them as well, but you know, sometimes the fight for me is not fun. In addition, you have to consider also what class is played. I mainly play melee characters, and if you play, for example, a ranged character, things and your perception might change drastically in this regard. As said, this is a very subjective point here. And these were my thoughts on Elden Ring Nightreign. Just to sum things up, it's difficult to rate this game in any way, I think, because it's competently made. They made good changes, they made good improvements with the last few patches to the game, so it now works definitely better than it did on release. But on the other hand, you also have to like the core gameplay loop, which is always starting a new run, starting at level 1 and then leveling up and hopefully being powerful enough to defeat the final boss, which will take a few tries for sure. And if you die there, you start anew. But the good thing is you can play with your friends and struggle together. And if you like this idea, it might be for you, but if you want single player Elden Ring exploration just with your friends, then maybe that is not for you, because Elden Ring Nightreign offers very little of that, and it's a very hectic game, a game where you are constantly on the hurry. You have to find loot, you have to get runes, you have to level up, you don't have much time to read anything. The zone is constantly in your neck, and at some point you have a clue what you are doing, you have a game plan, you follow it, and you will see much success then with it, and then it becomes about min-maxing and maybe finding other challenges in the game, and hopefully also to FromSoft being able to add enough more interesting content to the game that player keep engaged with it and keep the game alive. We will see if this will work, but definitely an interesting game, an interesting experiment, and I would call it quite successful from FromSoft's perspective, though you also have to consider it is definitely not for everyone. Thank you for watching. All there is left to say now is I hope you found this video useful. If so, feel free to press the like button. I would much appreciate that. Maybe subscribe, and also write me in the comments how you liked Elden Ring Nightreign, or if you consider getting it, if this was any helpful, any form, if you agree with my points or not. Would be interesting to know about this. Further, always a huge thank you and shout outs to all the people supporting me on all my different channels. And again, thank you for watching, and see you people next time. Goodbye.